friend. The Mystical American Patriots Society is transmitting to you from beneath 4 million cubic feet of solid granite, in the burning heart of the Yellowstone caldera. This is a variety program for normal sandwich-eating Americans with some concerns about living in a deranged, post-Christian technocracy. So, keep your third eye on the sky and your ear to the ground, as Sumo and Smokestack connect your main brain vein to a higher plane. Are you ready? Stand by.
I went to the woods because I wanted to live deliberately, to front the only essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear, nor did I wish to practice resignation, unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck all the marrow out of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner and to reduce it to its lowest terms. And if it proved to be mean, why, then to get the whole and genuine meanness of it, and publish its meanness to the world, or if it were sublime, to know it by experience and be able to give a true account of it in my next excursion. For most men, it appears to me, are in a strange uncertainty about it, whether it is of the devil or of God, and have somewhat hastily concluded that it is the chief end of man here to glorify God and enjoy him forever. Still, we live meanly, like ants, though the fable tells us we long ago changed into men. Like pygmies, we fight with cranes. Now, my friends, there exists a pot, a clay earthen vessel, currently held in the Florence National Archaeological Museum in Italy, originally of Etruscan origin, which existed broadly in the region we now call Tuscany today. It's estimated to be from about the 4th century BC. And on this pot there is a man, a tiny man, a man whose limbs are not quite proportional to his torso. A man that might be vaguely African, but it's hard to say. This man holds a rectangular shield in one hand and a pointed spear in the other. He is nude apart from his sandals, and he is locked in combat with a large bird violently pecking his shield. Yes, my friends, what we have here is a scene from the forgotten 1,000-year war, the war when pygmies fought with cranes. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Pretty good. I'm not being genocided by cranes, so that's nice.
Yeah, always a plus.
I'm having technical issues. I got a new microphone, but then when I plug it in, it won't let me hear sounds. I don't know why that should be. I have to figure that out. But that quote from that at the start was "Where I lived and what I lived for" by Thoreau.
Thoreau, okay. He quotes the Heidelberg Catechism in there. That was pretty interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think he was of the Heidelberg persuasion, if you know what I mean. I mean, the guy had the neck beard like you couldn't believe.
Yeah, true.
Which is maybe the thing to know about him most, is that his beard is literally none of it is on his face.
Mm-hmm.
He has a full profile face, chin and cheeks, and everything, and then there's hair underneath it. It's one of the worst beards I've ever seen. The only worst one was this old man that I used to know who used to go to church, and he had the worst neck beard that I've ever witnessed. And I kept wanting to tell him, but I never did.
It's a hard thing to break to somebody that their beard looks terrible.
Yeah, it's a very hard thing to break to somebody, to break to a man like, listen, man, you cannot grow a beard.
Yeah.
It's awful, and you should stop. And that's not always bad. Some people just aren't genetically like a lot of our Asian friends.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have good facial hair genes.
Yeah.
Now, some of them will have the great gene for the mustache
Mm-hmm.
if they choose to go that route.
Right.
But it's a hard thing to break to someone, and it makes you question someone's judgment. Like this threw all of Thoreau's work into doubt for me when I saw a picture of him, because he really should have known how bad that looked.
Yeah.
So, and like I said, he may have been of the Heidelberg persuasion. He never married.
Wait, what?
So, so well, I mean, it could be that, or it could be he just no woman wanted to go live in his wood cabin at Walden Pond or whatever.
Right.
Which you can't fault him for, because who would want to live with an emo guy, like an 18th century emo guy, just sort of writing poetry by a pond
And sponging off his mother.
and sponging off his mother, which is the other part they don't tell you about him.
Yep.
Is that he only lived there because he was like a trust fund baby.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't. We had a school trip up the eastern seaboard, and I did. And well, I went to a school that only had one bus, right?
Yep.
And it was a green bus, and we called it the pickle because it looked like a pickle. And the driver, there was only one or two drivers, like only one or two faculty members with CDL licenses or whatever you need for a bus. And one of them was the vice president of the school, or the vice principal. And we were supposed to go to like Vermont or something for some reason. But then he had to stop for like 4 hours at Walden Pond and just sit there and contemplate that he was not Thoreau, but he wanted to be. And I still resent him for that.
It sounds really lame.
It's been a long time. It's been a long time, but and you know what? His beard was also awful.
Noticing a theme.
I think it goes together. But yeah, today we're going to talk about the Forgotten War. Well, war is generous. Let us rather say the forgotten genocide of the pygmy peoples of this planet by a species of giant birds. Past couple of shows, we discussed the forgotten history of the giants, the races of giants.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that makes people, because people are like, it gives at least me, perhaps it rubs off on you a little bit, but at least me, this aura of like, I'm the guy that thinks everything is fake except for ancient giants.
Yeah, I think maybe we could be typecast that way.
Yeah.
Somewhat fairly.
But, okay, but here's the thing. That's true. A. And then, but B, that's not true. I also think other things are true, like ancient pygmies. So today we're going in the opposite direction, and we're going to look into the destruction and elimination of an entire section of the human species. We're going to talk about really the final solution to the pygmy problem. Not by marauding bands of Jews, which is what happened to the giants.
Mm-hmm.
Led by Joshua. But instead by cranes, which, to be honest, it's not that unbelievable. I mean, anyone that's been around a long-necked waterfowl knows that they are absolute bastards. I mean, geese.
Yeah, they're very ill-tempered.
Swans.
Mm-hmm.
Both of them will hiss and snip at you for no reason.
Oh, yeah.
Ducks, too, really. They're just small. They hiss at anyone. Like the Muscovy ducks especially. I don't know, are you familiar with Muscovy ducks? I know a lot about ducks.
No, I'm not that familiar with duck species.
I'm a duck connoisseur. A Muscovy duck they're like black and white feathers, but the defining feature is they have a bulbous red head that almost looks like it's covered in cancer.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, they have that head, and it's got all these little bumps on it.
Mm-hmm.
It's strange. And the Muscovy duck is notable for being the only species of duck that does not quack. It is mute. It says nothing but hiss. It goes just like that. It just hisses at you, and they also kill snakes. They're very intense ducks.
Awesome.
But But those Muscovy ducks, so if you have a pond and you have too many snakes, you put a few Muscovy ducks in there. And the other day, actually, I was riding my bicycle and I came across a duck that appeared to be half Muscovy, half mallard, which I've never seen before.
Mm-hmm.
It was an abomination of nature. It was ugly, but it had beautiful feathers. Anyway, waterfowl are mean. I don't make the rules. They're just violent animals.
Yeah.
They're violent homicidal maniacs. I don't know why. Well, now I think about it, maybe it's not waterfowl per se. The violence may come from being a bird with a long neck, which just happens to be a lot of waterfowl, because ostriches and emu and cassowary are also violent birds.
Oh, yeah.
And now that I'm thinking of it, that makes sense, because if you're an animal with a long neck, like a goose or an ostrich or something, or cassowary, which is just a velociraptor with feathers,
Mm-hmm.
Like a 3-foot neck is a big vulnerability to a predator.
Indeed.
It's a fragile organ. Like if a coyote or a dingo gets a hold of your 3-foot neck and you're a bird, it's not good. So maybe they have to be hyper aggressive as a survival strategy. Maybe that's why swans are the way they are. Who knows? I do know that long-necked birds are mean, and on today's show, I am officially accusing cranes of genociding the world's pygmies, to the point that today there are only pygmies of any real concentrations in the Congo. The cranes genocided the pygmies from the rest of the world, and it is my hope that by bringing this atrocity to light, this absolute atrocity, that we will finally be able to, as a nation, bring these birds to justice and hold them accountable.
So we're going to have like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission?
We talk about the Nazis, and rightly so. But what the cranes did was far worse. Because there are still Jews. There are very few pygmies left. Mm-hmm. And the ones that are left, it's questionable they're the same tribe. And they have to be held, the cranes have to be held accountable, because they have yet to be held accountable by anyone. They have not been canceled. They have not been defamed by the media. If anything, they have been protected and coddled and given preservation land. But no more. No more. Today we settle old wrongs. I'm like Martin Luther King Jr. in that regard. And we shall overcome. We're marching to Zion.
It's beautiful.
His truth is marching on.
Yeah.
And the cranes cower when I say that. But before we dive into that, I believe you wanted to also talk about a bird.
Indeed.
You want to talk about a rooster, I think. You told me we're going to talk about roosters.
We're going to talk about, this is the segment.
And you didn't know I was going to talk about cranes, so it's just a synchronicity. Yeah.
It's the bird show today on Maps. Hi, gang. It's Smokestack cutting in here from the production room. I did talk about roosters, but we were hit by a series of technological and metaphysical attacks during that segment, which made it all but unlisten-intoable. So I will re-record and release that segment as a midweek update this week. Hope that's okay. Don't at me.
Okay. So, before we delve down into the meat of this issue, right, this genocide by birds, because what happened in the past is that pygmies were slaughtered by cranes. Let's just be frank about it.
I mean, that's a big claim.
It is a big claim. But before we get into it, let's define our terms, because I don't want to be accusing species of birds that are not responsible.
Okay.
I don't want to be giving giving victim status to people who don't deserve it. Right? I don't want to be pointing to a certain group of pygmies and saying, give them sympathy. And I don't want to be pointing to a certain group of birds and saying, hey, them, right? If they don't deserve it.
Okay.
So, cranes and pygmies, what are they? So, first of all, Smokestack, is a crane a heron? A heron?
No, I think they're different.
Is a crane a stork?
No.
Correct. Let's be very clear, right, who we're accusing. I don't want our Antifa type listeners who listen to the show, and welcome, going into the streets and the ponds and the aquifers and slaughtering herons for the crimes against the people of color committed by cranes.
Okay.
Right? I want to just that would be like beating up an Asian person when you could instead beat up a European person.
Mm-hmm.
It just, you know,
don't do it.
Yeah. So I sort of so we decided that they are not the same. But what is the difference between a crane and a heron, Smokestack? How can you tell? We have to get a little bit in biology on this show.
A heron has like a plume on top of its head, does it not?
That's true, but sometimes cranes do also, depending on the crane species. So that's not a... Do you have any other guesses?
That's probably the extent of my guesses.
Okay, all right. All right, so admittedly, it is sort of hard to tell if you're not a naturalist like me. They look very similar. They have similar behavior. They both stand in water and fish with their beaks, right? But they are distinct families of birds that do not interbreed. And if your bloodlust for revenge for the horrors that you're about to hear about on this show, I don't want you out murdering innocent victims. So, how to tell the difference between a heron and a crane. Number 1, heron versus crane 101. Number 1 tell is cranes cannot perch in trees.
Oh, okay.
All right? Herons can and often do. They prefer to. The toes of a crane's foot are not all the same length. So they have birds normally have 4 toes. And the front 3 are 1 length on a crane, and the 4th one is on the back is shorter. So it can't actually wrap around a branch and grab it and hold on.
Oh, okay.
So cranes never sit in trees. If you see a crane sitting in a tree, it's not a crane, and you don't have to shoot it with a shotgun.
Okay.
A heron, by contrast, has equal length toes all around. So it makes its nest in the trees. Right?
Right.
Herons are almost always in the trees when they're not in the water. Number 2 is cranes fly with their necks completely outstretched. No bend in the neck. Herons, by contrast, fly with a retracted neck, tucked close to the shoulders.
Ah.
Right? So if you see a bird take off before you shoot it out of the sky for social justice, check the neck. Right?
Got it.
If straight, obliterate. Remember that phrase? It's useful for antiphal types of many different species. If straight, obliterate. Right? That's the crane and also maybe the people.
Right.
If you're antiphal.
Okay.
Right? And this is an inclusive show. Third tell that may be useful is if you see the creature with a child, kill it. Very similar again. If you see that is a sign of oppression. Because herons always keep their chicks at the nest. They bring the food to the chicks. Cranes, alternatively, take the chicks out from the nest and bring them to the food.
Okay.
Right. So if a long-necked bird is waiting in the water with a chick beside it, it's a crane. If you see the bird exhibiting nuclear family type behavior, murder it. Right. Remember, if straight, obliterate. If it has a chick, I can't think of a rhyme, but blow it up.
Okay.
Right? It is guilty. Okay, so I hope that spares the noble herons, because they are not the colonialists.
The heron is the friend of the mystical American Patriot Society.
Right. However, one must also be careful to not mistake the storks for cranes. Again, a different bird. Again, not guilty of original sin. And this one is arguably more important to get right because the heron, because for thousands of years the stork has carried with it the stigma of the cranes, unjustly identified with the crane behavior. As Benjamin Grundy from Mysterious Universe pointed out, probably the reason that we have the mythos of a stork delivering babies is because in times past, normal non-pygmy people would see cranes flying overhead carrying little tiny pygmy men away to go eat them. And that's probably where the story comes from, and they misidentified them as storks carrying babies. So the stork has this relation that it does not deserve. So already we have the legacy of the crane atrocities being transmuted onto the swan, and that's no good. We'll not perpetuate that lie here. So in order to protect, again, our listener from making that same mistake, here's how you can tell a stork from a crane. 1, storks are strict carnivores. They only eat meat.
Oh.
If you see the bird eating a vegetable of any kind, you can be sure that it is not a stork and much more likely to be a crane. Arguably, and most important, storks are mute. They do make no calls whatsoever, just like Muscovy ducks, who just... Cranes, on the other hand, are highly vocal and call all the time. Because these storks don't have a syrinx. Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with not having a syrinx?
No, I have one.
Well, you don't have a syrinx.
Oh.
Syrinx is a bird anatomy thing.
Okay.
It's sort of the vocal cord equivalent of birds. It's more like they're not vocal cords, they're vocal folds. Mm-hmm. Like sort of in the trachea. It's sort of a different thing, but that's how birds make their sounds. And the storks don't have any. They have a nice smooth trachea with no folds.
Storks will snap their beaks at you though.
Correct.
Yeah.
I'm not saying they're nice or polite, but they're not guilty of genocide.
Yeah.
Right? And then number 3, a stork has a heavy, thick bill, and a crane has a needle, spear-like bill for like stabbing pygmies in the heart. Mm-hmm. Just pew, 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 pew. Okay. So now you know, and knowing is half the battle. That's half the equation of this war is the cranes of this dark period in human history. But the other half is the pygmies. What are pygmies? Who are we speaking of? Do I mean the African pygmies of the Congo Basin, which still exist in large numbers? Do I mean the Terran peoples of Myanmar, among whom the adult men, even to this day, are barely 4 foot tall? Mm-hmm. Incidentally, have you heard of the Terran people?
I've not.
Probably not, yeah. But would you like to guess why?
They're trying to keep their secrets because they possess powerful magic.
Well, that could be too, but I was thinking it's just because there are only 5 of them left.
Oh. Well, that's
not 500, not 5,000, there are 5. There's about 1 Terroni for each of the fingers on your hand, assuming you're not a Nephilim.
I think I'd be about, making some babies if my people were down to single digits.
Here's the thing. They actually are purposefully going extinct.
They're doing it on purpose?
Yeah, so like the Terran were first discovered and cataloged in the late 1960s. They were believed to be like a mythical race, like because they're in the Himalayas, mm-hmm. and researchers like Western researchers, and even honestly, most like Eastern researchers from like India and stuff thought that these were like the Himalayan people's version of talking about gnomes.
Okay.
Right? They were like, oh yeah, the Terran, they come in the night and they steal our pies off the windowsill. Mm-hmm. Hardy-yardy-yar. And they thought it was just like, oh, it's some folk belief. But then they actually found them. There was a little tribe of tiny people living in the mountains. The women are about 3 feet tall. The men maybe about 4.
So they're really hobbits.
They're true hobbits. Yeah, they're a tiny hobbit race that maybe they really steal pies off the windows. I don't know. I mean, you wouldn't even really be mad, would you?
No. I'd be like,
oh, that's so cute.
Yeah.
If a little 3.5 foot tall man just came and like ran away with a pie you had on the windowsill, you'd be like, that little that little booger.
He'd have to say, hee as he ran away. That would.
Right. Yeah. Right. You wouldn't even really be mad. So maybe that's what they did. But when they discovered them in the 70s, there were like 60, 70 of them. Mm-hmm. But they had an extraordinarily high rate of birth defects.
Oh.
Maybe from the inbreeding at this point or something. It's not clear why. But they had goiter, they had mental retardation, they had creatinism, which is congenital iodine deficiency syndrome, which is a lot of bad stuff. And the elders of their tribe had decided it would just be better to die off than to continue, and they forbid marriage, and they practiced all sorts of sexualities that did not create kids. I don't mean that they were all gay, but they just, would use a lot of contraception and stuff.
Sure.
And who knows why? I mean, they may have had the birth defects because they clandestine watering poisoned by the Burmese cranes. Who can say? just a continued
say?
war.
Yeah.
But they just decided to go extinct, and they largely have, and today there are only 5 of them left that we know of that are full-blooded Terran. And in the photo of them, one of them looks to be missing a leg, so they're not a great shape as a people.
Mm-hmm.
If anyone would like to go and do a Terran breeding program to bring them back, and you may have to interject some foreign blood in there and then breed them back down to small size, like you would with a Pomeranian, because I don't know. It's sort of like, have you ever looked at how they bring dog breeds back that were no longer existing?
No.
You find the dogs that have like those traits or have like some partial heritage of that, and you keep promoting those traits to bring those genes back out. It's an interesting process, and I think you could probably do it with the Terran people. You could breed them like Pomeranians. I don't know if they would be up for it. But not all hope is lost. There's a small ray of sunshine for them.
Okay.
Maybe. And also, that's a ray of sunshine for you, listener, because if you think population demographics in the West is bad, just think of the Terrans.
Indeed.
There's only 5 of them, and one of them doesn't have a foot.
Mm-hmm.
I thought I had it bad because I had no shoes until I met the man who had no feet, kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, so who are we talking about when we say pygmies? Well, in Greek mythology, which is where we first read about the Pygmy Crane War, we read about them in the Iliad, actually, in Book 3, but also in the writings of Pliny the Elder. They are a race of dwarf people, and pygmy, by the way, comes from the Greek word for cubit, so they're implying that they're around a cubit tall, which would be very short.
Mm-hmm.
A cubit's from your elbow to the tip of your middle finger. That would be very, very small. I think that may be an exaggeration. I tend to think that they're more about 3 foot tall, like the Terran people.
Right.
But according to Pliny the Elder, they're a race of dwarves reported to live in India and south of modern-day Ethiopia. Very coincidentally, in both the places, we still find the Pygmies.
Oh.
The Terrans and the African Congolese Pygmies. Isn't that fascinating? The ancient Greeks seem to know the locations of both of the most prominent tribes of Pygmies in the world. It's like, because presumably the Terrans at this time were a far greater extent,
So when people read the Greeks on this topic, they just assumed they were talking about some sort of legend or folktale or something. I mean, is that the common understanding of reading these texts? Yeah,
well, that's how modern people do.
Okay.
Right. They thought they were quite serious, as we will see.
Mm-hmm.
But the point is, the ancient world was not as disconnected and isolated as we now suppose. I mean, they got around.
True. Don't ever assume that historical peoples were stupid.
Yeah, don't do that. So, yes, Book 3 of the Iliad actually begins thusly. Quote, "Marshaled together under their leaders, the Trojans advanced with cries and clamor. A clamor like birds, cranes in the sky, flying from winter's storm and unending rain, flowing towards the streams of ocean, bringing the clamor of death and destruction to pygmy tribes, bringing evil and strife at the break of day. The Achaeans, however, breathing fury, firm and resolved to aid each other, came on in silence." So that's one of the earliest references to the Pygmy Crane Wars. Pliny the Elder, for his part, reports that the Pygmies fought the cranes with bows and arrows while riding around on little mounted goats. Which is adorable.
Indeed.
It's adorable to imagine a little man on a riding a goat with a tiny bow and arrow.
Mm-hmm.
You just want to bake him a pie and leave it on the windowsill.
You do, yeah.
So, if it is the ancestors of those Congolese people, and to all of our Congolese listeners, you have to start riding around on goats again. That would be so cute. All of our pygmy listeners. But if there was this little tribe of people using goat, I mean, I don't know. It's the modern pygmies of Africa are too large to ride on goats is the problem. They're not big, but they're too big to ride on a goat. And they're also too big to really be threatened that much by a crane.
They're like 4 feet.
Yeah,
area,
they're like
right?
and they're like a stout 4 feet.
Mm-hmm.
They're not a goat would have trouble So I think that throws some doubt that maybe they're the same people in this legend, unless they have bred more with big people in the interim and have gotten larger since then, which is possible. Maybe. Okay, so Pliny also says the pygmies must spend 3 months of every year raiding the nests of the cranes and destroying/eating their eggs. Otherwise, if they don't cull the number of cranes in their infancy, the pygmies would never survive the onslaught of the birds when they were full grown and came in number.
Wow.
Right. Which sort of now you feel sympathetic for the Nazis, don't you?
What? No.
Because the Jews are killing their eggs. Right? They're breaking them up. And I'm using this because we're talking about this was a genocide and Holocaust.
Okay.
And in this analogy, the birds are clearly the Nazis. But you see where the Nazis are. Everyone had a point, you know? Tim Dillon made this. He's like, everyone had a point. The guy that was flying into the World Trade Center, if you'd asked him why you're doing this, he'd have been like, listen, the U.S. forces have been destroying our country for decades and raiding it of its wealth and leaving us impoverished and starting wars. And he'd be like, you know what? You're right. You know, and then you sit back down and you wait for the plane to crash. Because you'd be like, phew, I mean, he's got a point. You know, and then everyone had a point. And the cranes had a point. They're like, listen, they're destroying our, now they probably, according to the Pygmies, they started it. You know, but then after a couple generations of this war, the cranes don't remember that. They started it. And then.
Yeah.
It's a complicated issue. Everyone's got a point, you know? So, you know, don't look too harshly on the past. Because, you know, you see where the Nazis are coming from here. By Nazis, I mean cranes, obviously. Okay. A lot of clips that could be taken out of context there.
Indeed. Yeah.
But that's okay. That's okay. Because I think all of our listeners know I'm using the analogy for the birds. Okay, now, so again, it's tempting to peg them to the modern African pygmies. It's tempting to peg them to the Terran, and maybe it's both, right? But if you want to peg them to modern pygmies, you have to argue one of two things, right? Either that they've grown in size since then, because the Pliny ones he's talking about seem to be much smaller. Right? Or that maybe the birds were larger back then. Okay. Right? Which I think is also a possibility. Because there's extinct species of cranes that were larger. So,
well, I mean, seems to be a trend of megafauna generally are losing population. Correct.
So imagine that you're a 3-foot man being attacked by a emu-sized crane. It'd be pretty scary.
Yeah.
Right? Like I say, and also the big problem is that the pygmies come from the word cubit, and so that they're not quite. I don't know. African pygmies seem too tall, and Terran people seem too tall too. Maybe. Okay. I mean, it would be like fighting a dinosaur if you were 3 foot tall and there was a 6 foot tall.
Yeah.
It'd be very scary. I mean, no wonder you need a goat and a bow and arrow. And I would rather be eaten by a lion than a bird.
Yeah,
easily.
I think the lion would go for the neck and just sort of put you out of your misery.
Exactly. The bird is just going to peck at you and grab off pieces of your flesh at random, and raise its neck up, honk, honk, as it sort of wiggles its neck to get it down its throat, and then it will peck at you again, and you have to just sit there and writhe around and watch.
Yeah, there's no way to go.
It would be bad, right? So, when we speak of the pygmies, we figured out who the cranes are. When we speak of the pygmies, we might be referring to the present-day African pygmies. We may be referring to the Terran people. We may be both or neither. Take your pick, really. It's hard to say. They didn't really narrow it down at all. But this is because Pliny the Elder states that the pygmies were forced into a nomadic lifestyle, driven from their ancestral home.
Man.
Just much like the Jews. Again, now we have the sympathy for the Jews. To try and escape the onslaught of the cranes. You know, quote from Pliny the Elder. This whole region, the Black Sea coast of Thrace, was occupied by the Scythian tribe called the Ploughmen, their towns being but ... and Gerania stated to have been the abode of the race of Pygmy, which is translated pygmy. Their name and local dialect used to be Kaitsi, and there is a belief they were driven away by cranes. That's in Pliny the Elder, Natural History, Book 4, 44. Right? Okay, so now there would be one thing. It would be just like if this was just Pliny and it was just, you could think that it was some Grecian folk myth, like an Aesop's fable. You know? And in fact, Aesop talks about the Pygmies. In Aesop says, in like the 500 to 600 BCs, Aesop says, there were some cranes who came to nibble at a field which a farmer had recently sown with wheat. The farmer began throwing rocks at the cranes, and a good many of them were crippled. As the cranes abandoned the field, they cried to one another, let's run away to the land of the Pygmies. It's one of Aesop's early fables. Doesn't really teach much of a moral. He was working it out.
Yeah.
He was like, I'm going to be a fable maker.
They can't all be winners, you know.
Can't all be winners. And so you were tempted to think, oh, this is just one of Aesop's fables. This is like the fox and the sour grapes. You know, it's just we lost the meaning of what it means to be pygmy attacked by a crane. But it was just something that the ancient Greeks liked. But it does not appear to be so. In fact, because the great philosopher himself, Aristotle, wrote this in the History of Animals. He said, quote, the cranes do this, for they travel from Scythia to the marshes in the higher parts of Egypt, from which the Nile originates. This is the place where the Pygmies dwell. And here's the kicker, quote, and this is no fable, for there is really, as it is said, a race of dwarves, both men and horses, which lead the life of troglodytes. Aristotle, arguably the founder of Western civilization, or at least the intellectual basis of it, saith, this is no fable. Look, guys, there is a race of dwarfs that live like troglodytes, and a troglodyte is a person that lived in a hole in the ground, or a cave.
Right, okay.
So he's saying the Pygmies lived in caves, or holes they dug. Right?
So all these people that are arguing that Tolkien was not writing fiction are looking real good right now.
Yes. There's another Greek guy. He lived around the year 100 AD or so, 700 years after Aesop. So they're still talking about this, like, as a real event that happened and is still happening. This was like lasting like 1,000 years. He was a Greek grammarian named Antonius Liberalis. And he says, he states that he believed the Pygmies were being punished by the gods for their immodesty. Because in all the pottery and all the artwork, of which there is like hundreds of examples, and not just from Greece, but like from all over, they're always naked. Like the Pygmies didn't like wearing clothes. For whatever reason. Maybe they were proud of themselves because they're also always depicted as having very large genitals. I don't know what the reason is. But Antonius saith, quote, among the people we call the Pygmies, there was born a girl called, and I can't pronounce these names, Onoi, who was of flawless beauty, but she was graceless by nature and overweening. She cared not a rap for Artemis or Hera. She was married to one of the citizens, Nicodemus, a good and sensible man, and gave birth to a child called Mopsos. And all the Pygmies, who loved to show kindliness, brought her many gifts to celebrate the birth of the child. But Hera found fault with Onoi for not honoring her, and turned her into a crane, elongated her neck, and ordained that she should be a bird that flew high. She also caused a war to arise between her and the Pygmy. Yearning for her child Mopsos, Onai flew over houses and would not go away, but all the Pygmies armed themselves and chased her away. Because of this, there arose a state of war, then as well as now, between the Pygmies and the cranes. 700 years after Aesop's first recording of it, or maybe Homer's first, it's unclear which was exactly the first, still going on.
Whoa.
Right? There's this tiny, as Aristotle said, there's a tiny race of people that live in holes and fight cranes. And maybe they ride on goats. And so you might say at this point, okay, Sumo. Okay, Smokestack. The Greeks had a fable, maybe even a religious tale about divine retribution for immodesty or something, and they took it too seriously and they thought it was real, but that doesn't mean it really was real, right? But, dear listener, 'tis not only the Greeks who spoke of the pygmies and cranes. No. Indeed, in many academic publications from the time when you could trust such a thing, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we find all sorts of references. Indeed, I found a paper called in the journal Folklore on JSTOR, the website JSTOR, volume 86, number 2 from 1975. The paper titled "The Battle of the Pygmies and the Cranes in Chinese, Arab, and North American Indian Sources."
Wow.
It was indeed a global phenomenon and globally recorded over the course of 1,000 years. The 5th century Chinese religious text, the Shinai King, states, quote, "In the region of Shahai, in the land of the cranes, where men and women are only 7 inches tall, the only creatures they fear are cranes, which come here from the sea. The cranes, which in one single flight travel 1,000 miles to gobble them up."
I mean, 7 inches is pretty short.
That is very short. That's a little too. I think they're being a little exaggerating there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Chinese, though they record everything, they have a predilection for exaggeration. That's what you got to understand. When you read Chinese history, they record everything, but there are people that of fish tales. They like to make their fish seem bigger than they were. That's what you got to understand about Chinese history. It's all real, but it's all a little exaggerated. So the Chinese basically have the same, but that's basically the same story. A small people, ludicrously small in this case, but like a Chinese Tom Thumb, basically, versus the cranes. However, it does have it's the same story, essentially. Tiny people being genocided by cranes. And that's not the only Chinese source. Arabic scholars in the 14th century, as late as the 14th century, this is the 1300s, and one particular Italian missionary named Friar Odric, they wrote an agreement that in China there were tales of remnant populations of pygmies who had fled their homelands and were still to that day struggling to survive in the face of the crane's final solution. The Arab account states the following, quote, "Here grow little men who have but 5 palms length." So that's very small. 5 of your hands, your palms stacked on top of each other. 5 palms length. "And though they be little and not fit for weighty matters, yet they are brave and clever at weaving and at keeping cattle." And it's ridiculous to imagine a 2-foot man keeping cattle, but whatever. It's hilarious. I hope that is true, and that in the past there were these tiny little gnomes keeping cattle. That would be great. "And know ye that these men have children when they be but 12 years old, and live commonly to but 40 years, and have not the proper age. Valiantly they defend themselves from cranes, and take and eat." So that's the Arabs saying that.
Wow.
Not only that, but maps from the Renaissance era and before give hints that the pygmies fled north to Scandinavia and beyond. For on these old maps, just at the top, near basically around Norway, it's just the word written pygmies. Just pygmy. Like there's some pygmies up here. And one of the best guys that found this was Canadian Arctic explorer and researcher John Mackay, who wrote a book called Discovering the Mammoth, in which he traced like the mammoth remains of the far north, and he was trying to trek out like how the mammoths got. He did a whole bunch of mammoths. But while he was doing this, he was looking at ancient maps and stuff, and he noted in Scientific American, quote, "When researching Renaissance map imagery last year for another article, I came across several maps with little vignettes of the war between the pygmies and the cranes set in Arctic Canada."
Maybe they were fighting geese in Canada.
You're ahead of me. You're ahead of me. Okay. So listen, but this makes you think, were the little people attested all over the globe in every culture, like going by different names, pixies maybe, elves, fairies, gnomes, leprechauns, and so on, were these just actual 100% real little physical tiny people who just used to live here?
Yeah.
but we're just like there was just a tiny group of herdsmen that kept goats in the Irish plains that were then genocidally wiped out by angry waterfowl. Maybe,
Maybe.
right?
Maybe.
Maybe. Now, of course, this is the mystical American Patriot Society, so we must always ask, where's the connection to America? I mean, we talked about Canada, and that's technically North America, but it's also maple syrup land.
Yeah.
It doesn't really count. Everyone up there is going, "Ooh, quoi, c'est quoi?" Eh? That's how they are. Is there a connection to America? Is the genocidal pygmy crane conflict rooted in our land and history?
Yes.
Yes, of course it is. First of all, as far as pygmies go, we can all think back fondly to the American history of pygmies in 1904 when we put one in the Bronx Zoo.
We did?
So that's nice. Yeah. Fellow named Oda Binga. It's a great name for a pygmy, Oda Binga. He was a tragic tale all around. He married young, as you do when you're a pygmy, as the Arabic people said. And that's true because Oda Binga was an African pygmy, and that's true even today. African pygmies do not live that long. Nobody talks about it because, like pygmies are like the limit case of human biodiversity in a number of ways.
Okay.
And they sort of are a big like thumb in the eye of people that want to pretend everyone's exactly the same.
Mm-hmm.
But African pygmies live only like 18 to 25 years. Very short life expectancy. Although one could maybe argue it's just from them being poor and living in the jungle, because Oda lived to be 33 when he was in America.
Okay.
Ancient for a pygmy.
Right.
After getting out of the zoo. And he would have lived longer, except he shot himself in the heart with a pistol.
Oh.
Because he couldn't return home due to World War I. All the shipping was shut down. They lost his skeleton, actually. It was dug up and removed, which is very odd. America has a long history of disappearing the bones of both giants and little people. We really don't know where his skeleton. He was buried, and they went to dig him up to like bury him in a nicer place because people felt bad that they kept him in a zoo, and now he's just gone. I don't know. We just don't like the bones of people of diversity of size for some reason. But yeah, Odo was born in 1883, and he married young, as pygmies do, started a family. One day he went elephant hunting, which is pretty impressive for pygmies.
No kidding.
By the way, fighting elephants is a big step up from cranes. And he returned home to find his village had been slaughtered, and he was captured and sold into slavery by some local Bantus. Again, not white people.
Bantus.
Black people.
Yep.
The Bantus, who they like to do this to the pygmies. I don't know why. No hate. Just what it is. And of course, putting a pygmy in a zoo sounds a little bad, right? Sounds a little racist. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe. But the American in this story could be depicted as the good guy, because was he in Africa to try and collect pygmies? Yes. Was he doing it to bring them back to America and put them in display in an exhibit? Yes. Was this exhibit going to take place at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, where Alexander Graham Bell made the first public showing of a working wireless telephone, which he called the radiophone, and where William Röntgen first showed the world an X-ray machine? Yeah, he was going to put them there. So you had the first wireless telephone, the first X-ray, the first fax machine, actually, the first infant incubator, which has now become like the little isolates they use in a neonatal ICU. The first early cars were on display here by the Ford Motor Company, and the first airship contest of early dirigibles, and a pygmy zoo. 1904 was a rocking time at this World's Fair. There's a lot going on. Oh, and you know who else was there? Geronimo. He was in the Indian exhibit. Because we just had exhibits. They were like, you know how you go to a museum now and they'll have like they'll have like a display of cavemen,
and like wax figures and stuff.
Yeah, they were like, let's do that, but just use real people.
So they had the Geronimo just sort of sitting there.
Yeah, they got Geronimo, and they said, hey, come sit in the exhibit at the World Fair. We'll pay you. They paid them.
Hey,
Oda Bingo was paid to sit there.
His worst jobs.
Yeah, but anyway, was the American in Africa doing all these things? Was he collecting people for an exhibit? Sure. But did he force the Pygmies to come? No. No, he bought them at slave markets and then gave them their freedom and then asked them to voluntarily come with him to America and paid them. And then he paid for their way home. So that's something at least. He bought them out of slavery. That's nice.
Yeah.
Right? The man was named S.P. Werner. I couldn't figure out what his first name was, but he's S.P. Werner. He took Otta and 8 other Pygmies to the fair, and then he paid for their trip back home to Africa. And once back in Africa, Otta remarried. And then his second wife also died. Tragic. So not knowing what else to do and probably feeling depressed, Otta contacted Werner again and asked if he could come back to America for another gig. And Werner thought for a while about it. And he's like, I'm not sure what you could do in America. We don't have, after the World Fair exhibit closed, we don't have a lot of call for Pygmies. But he said, but Werner thought, Otta was like, I'm really hard up. And so he said, well, look, you were a smashing hit at the exhibit at the World's Fair. Maybe you come back to America and we put you in the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. Maybe. Which coincidentally also has some pottery from ancient Greece with pygmies fighting cranes on it. And Otta said, okay. And so they put him in a museum, like a little piece of living history. But after a while, that soured, and Otta became dissatisfied with his job and threw a chair at the head of the museum, Mr. Guggenheim. Soured.
Yeah.
Right? And so the professional relationship just wasn't working. So the museum arranged to transfer the Pygmy exhibit, which again was just Otta and sometimes a chimpanzee, to the zoo, the Bronx Zoo. Now, initially, it was sort of a more live-in job, like Otta just roamed around and helped the zookeepers with chores and such. But then some of the people in the zoo thought, hey, what if we put his hammock in an empty cage and give him a bow and arrow? Wouldn't that sell more tickets? And so they did. Because the sell was that the Pygmies were a demonstration of the Darwinian missing link, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're like, here's a chimpanzee. Here's the next step up. It's the Pygmy. Come look at him in the thing. And anyway, one thing led to another. There was a knife involved, some threats and so on. And by hook or by crook, Otta was sent to a seminary in Virginia where there happened to be a pistol he could find, and que sera, sera. It was World War I. He wanted to go home. He was tired of being in the zoo.
Understandable.
Right.
Yeah. Sad.
But is getting pygmies from a slave auction and putting them in zoos America's only connection to pygmy culture? No, it isn't. There's a deeper and more relevant connection here. And that is because of the Cherokee and their legend of the Tuskegee people, which I know, Cherokee listeners, I'm sorry, I butcher your language. You do too, honestly. I'm sort of mad. I'm sort of angry at the Native Americans for not keeping their linguistic traditions alive as much. The Navajo people did it so well, and they were useful in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
But the Cherokee people, their language has almost completely died, and it's shameful. But anyway, the Native American peoples, they all have these legends of the little people, and the Tuskegee were like the American version, Cherokee version of gnomes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they had this legend of them. They said, several thousand winters before we first came to these shores, some young men of the Cherokee Nation set out to see what was in the world. They traveled south until they came to a tribe of little people called Tuskegee. These people had very unusual shaped bodies and were hardly tall enough to come up to a man's knee. They did not have houses, but lived in nests scooped out of the sand, which were covered in dried grass, again, troglodytes. These little fellows were so weak and puny that they could not fight at all and were constantly afraid of the wild geese and other birds that came in great flocks from the south to make war on them. Just at the time travelers got there, they found the little men in great fear because there was strong wind blowing from the south, and it blew white feathers up and down the sand so that the Tuskegee knew their enemies were coming and would be here soon. The young Cherokee men asked them why they did not defend themselves, and they said because they did not know how. There was no time to make bows and arrows, but the travelers told them to take up sticks and use them as clubs, and they showed them some moves where to hit the birds on the necks to kill them. The wind blew for several days, and at last the birds came. There were so many that they were like a giant cloud in the air, and when they landed, the entire area was covered with birds so that no one could walk more than a few steps without bumping into one. The little man ran to their nests, and the birds followed and struck their long bills into the nest to pull them out and eat them. But this time the little men had their clubs, and they struck the birds on the neck the way the Cherokee young men had showed them, and managed after several hours to kill most of them. The other birds flew away in disappointment. The little men thanked the Cherokee young men for their help and gave them the best food they had until the travelers went on to see other tribes. They heard afterwards that the birds came again several times, but that the Svigdi always drove them off with their clubs. But one day, a flock of sandhill cranes came, and they were so tall the little men could not reach high enough to hit them on the neck, and after several hours of fighting, the cranes killed them all.
Oh, heartbreaker.
So again, just like with the giants, we have Native American cultural confirmation of the same myth, literally on the other side of the globe, an ocean away. How did that happen? Same folklore in the Mediterranean and China and in the Cherokee, and it was here before anyone from Europe got here. What are we to make of that? I don't know.
It's a thing.
It's strange, you know? Like, it'd be one thing if it was just an ancient Greece legend, but the fact that it's in China, and then it would be one thing also if it's just in China, because at least they had communication. And like this myth, like a Chinese historian could have come over to Greece,
Right,
talked and be like, it's a funny story, and then he brought it back, right? But there was no way for the Cherokee to have any knowledge of this, and yet, now that begs the question of how the Pygmies got there,
or how the Cherokee got there.
right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So. I don't know, but still, we're in the realm of stories. Now, to me, that's very, very like, this is. But what if I were to tell you that we actually have skeletal, paleontological evidence of the Pygmy Crane War?
What?
I know. This is from an NBC article from 2010, and the headline reads as follows: Giant storks may have fed on real-life hobbits. Yes, so the giant extinct stork, the Leptoptylos robustus, would have dwarfed the hobbit hominid Homo florensis, living on the Indonesian island of Flores. So on this island, there have been found actual skeleton remains of a tiny tribe of humans we have dubbed Homo florensis. And also, I'm probably mispronouncing that, but whatever. And also on this island, the remains of a now extinct species of stork, which was nearly double the height of this little man. Basically, it was the size of an emu. Quote from the article: the fossil remains of what may have been a hobbit-like species of human were discovered in 2003 at the Liang Boa cave on the Indonesian island of Flores. In that cave, scientists also unearthed a large number of bird fossils, including 20,000 to 50,000-year-old wing and leg bones from what appeared to have been a stork nearly 6 foot tall. From the size of its bones, we were initially expecting a giant raptor, which are commonly found on the islands, not a stork, said Major, a vertebrate paleontologist at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington. Flores lacked any large-bodied mammalian predators, no hyenas, lions, wolves, or dogs living on this island. So we think, in their absence, birds like storks moved in to fill that role. It was likely a ground-based hunter, as its bones were so thick, giving the bird an estimated weight of 35 pounds. So on the same island where they find these hobbit people, they find these giant storks that are now dead.
Wild. But now that's not a crane, that's a stork. So we're bringing the storks in on the guilt
I think my belief is that they are misidentifying it.
Okay.
They think it's a stork. I don't. And then the Cherokee thought it was geese. They were also involved, and the cranes came and finished them off. So maybe they're all to blame. Maybe if you're a long-necked bird, you just hate tiny people. And we should test this. We should get one of our listeners. If anyone knows a midget, we will bring him to a water bank. And my suspicion is that he will be attacked by birds. Now, I think that they will be very hostile to him. I mean, think about it. Have you ever seen a little person near the water?
Yes.
I'm just saying. You've been out. You've been out on like an aquifer, like you're a lake or a pond, and seen a midget standing there.
Well, maybe not.
See? Do you see what I mean? Hmm.
Okay.
Right?
Maybe it's an instinctual avoidance. It's like a
I
long blood
I
memory of the Crane War.
to be honest, I don't think I've ever seen a midget swim. I'm sure they do, but you know, it's. I'm just saying. If we need to get, I'm sure some of our I don't and I think that they don't like being called midgets now. I'm not sure. I can't keep up. There was one little person that was like, we don't like midgets now, we like little people. And then someone was like, I don't like little people. That makes me sound so I don't know, you know what I'm talking about.
Right.
The small people.
You can't win.
The people that could be the Oompa Loompas or that could fit in an R2D2 costume for a movie.
Mhm.
Um
But that's not the
that,
same thing as a pygmy, though. It's a different.
no, but my suspicion is the birds will hate them anyway.
Okay.
I think the birds hate all of us and we're just too big. And then if you give them a small enough person, they will attempt to destroy it.
I mean, I've seen plenty of videos of geese going after young children.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? So I think we need to test this with real life Tyrion of Lannister, or whatever his name was from Game of Thrones.
Okay.
That little guy. Was he Tyrion? Maybe.
I don't know.
We need to get a bunch of him. And just put them in a room full of swans and cranes and herons and test to see which is the most violent.
Why don't we just do a reenactment of the battle?
Give them a little club.
Yeah.
That would be adorable and also violent.
Mm.
It would be like Adora violent. We could make a whole YouTube channel out of this. Midgets fight birds. I would watch midgets fight birds all day. Give midgets a club and make them fight various birds. Like, and you can move up. Like they start. It's like a video game.
Yeah.
Boss 1 is like a goose.
But we're doing it as like a scientific and historical study.
Right. That's what you always say.
To validate, your hypothesis.
I mean, it began as that, but now I'm just in it for the entertainment.
Okay.
Honestly. Like, I want to get the smallest person we can find, the smallest adult man we can find. Give him a club, and we'll start him off fighting a goose.
Yeah.
Then we'll move up to a swan.
We'll work our way up to a shoebill stork.
Yes. And then if he beats all the storks, then we move on to the emus and the cassowaries, and the final boss is the ostrich. And if he can slay the ostrich, then I don't know what happens. He wins $1 million.
Okay.
Wouldn't this be a great show?
I think it would get some attention.
Midgets fight birds.
Yeah.
We need to bring back people. I told you about that show where they Man versus Beast.
Mm-hmm.
And the finale was midgets pulling a plane against an elephant also pulling a plane in a race. And it was amazing. And the midgets were fine with it.
Yeah.
And I think that they would also be fine in Mortal Kombat with birds. So get us in contact, listeners. If you are yourself a midget, or you know a midget or a little person, whatever you like to be called. I'm not sure. Don't get mad at me. Just tell me what you want to be called. If you want to be called a dwarf, it's fine. If you want to be called a hobbit, it's fine. Maybe I'll call you leprechauns.
I mean, I'd go with hobbit personally.
If I was an Irish dwarf, I would absolutely call myself a leprechaun. So just get in contact with us and we will arrange your Mortal Kombat with a bird and we'll film it.
You will be required to sign a waiver.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm not sure what YouTube's rules are on having people slaughter animals on their platform.
We can put it on BitChute.
Maybe use BitChute or Brand New Tube or something. By the way, if you guys aren't familiar with Brand New Tube instead of YouTube, Brand New Tube is the place to go if you want to hear boomers just going off in insanity.
Is that where all the Q people ended up?
Oh, it's great. It's like, listen, Trump is the secret president. The vaccines make you resonant with 5G and make your body magnetic. And my understanding is that if we just all eat fruit, that we will clear our third eyes and be able. I mean, it's fantastic. Brand new tube. Check it out if you just want to listen to people go insane.
Cool.
But anyway, yeah, it's the Pygmy Crane War. Why you should be a rooster. Domestic violence is not always bad, and save the children. Save children. That's the message today.